The outlook for this year's city election has been changed dramatically by the expected departure of Mayor Walsh to become President Biden's new Secretary of Labor. Two city councilors announced their candidacy for mayor 4 months ago, but it's expected the field will have more additional candidate. Our guest tonight is the first of those additional candidates. She's a large councilor, small business owner, and former teacher from Dorchester. We'd like to welcome Annissa Essaibi George. Thank you very much for being with us, councilor.
No, thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
I'd like to ask you about the beginning of your political career. A lot of our viewers know you from the city council, but go back before then, being head of a civic association or even when you were a high school student. What got you going?
Oh, Chris, thanks so much for the question. Thanks for the moment to step back in time and skip down memory lane. You know that I'm a graduate of the Boston Public Schools, and my years in high school, I was a member of BSAC, the Boston Student Advisory Council, as well as the State Student Advisory Council, and really fell in love with politics and especially municipal government, and realized as a high school student how important municipal government was to the everyday life of myself, of my classmates, but certainly realized the important role that municipal government played in our city and to families and residents across the city. After high school, was certainly involved in my community. I eventually became president of Columbia Savin Hill Civic, but also along the way, very much engaged in my community. I was the organizer and still help plan the Little Miss Dorchester contest every single year as part of the Dorchester Day parade and celebrations around the parade. I'm also a former director of the Fields Corner Main Streets program. Again, many, many years ago, it feels like a lifetime ago. But for me, community is where it's at, and local government is so important to the everyday lives of Bostonians.
Well, when you joined the council, one of the first things you wanted to pay attention to was the opioid crisis. People who go by mass and cast, they might look at that and say, well, that hasn't really gotten much better, but there's also more to it than that. So what would you say you've been able to accomplish as a counselor about that?
Yeah, so I'd say over the last 5 years, and in my capacity as an at-large city councilor, I've worked tirelessly around the challenges that homelessness creates for residents across our city, the challenges that the opioid crisis also creates for them, and inadequate access to mental health care services across the board. When we think about individuals who are unsheltered, when we think about families experiencing homelessness, that has been central to my work on the council. And for sure, anyone driving through the Massachusetts area, and unfortunately, in many parts of our city, you'll see how hard hit our communities are and our residents are by the opioid crisis. We continue to fight that battle. We continue to do that work. Mayor Walsh has been a leader in that space, but we see how hard of a fight it is to help those who are dealing with substance use disorders every single day. So we've been chipping away at some of the challenges the opioid crisis, homelessness, mental health bring us, and add on this layer of the COVID pandemic. And it's not just, it's a very thick layer when we think about the pandemic and its impact, especially for those that are unsheltered. The crisis is big and the work is great. And I feel so lucky every day to get to do this work. I hope to find an end to it soon.
In this race for mayor, we already have one graduate of Boston Public Schools in the mix. We might have another candidate with a strong background as an educational advocate. But what about your background as a teacher?
Yeah, sure. I taught for 13 years and so proud of those years teaching at East Boston High School, and so proud of my students and all that they've become. I was very grateful to have one of my former students, Jessica Martinez, introduce me at my announcement, announcing my run for mayor just last week, and we did it just in front of East Boston High School. I'm a proud graduate of Boston Tech, which is now the O'Brien, but so excited to share the experience I had as a classroom teacher and now as a BPS parent. I've got 4 high schoolers doing school virtually, although today is a little bit of a modified day because of this virtual snow day for our kids. That experience, both in the classroom and now as a Boston Public Schools parent, informs my work every single day on the council. I also serve as the council's chair of education, and our work around improving special education services, making sure that we don't have too many of our kids in sub-separate special education classrooms, making sure that we're doing all we should be doing to support vocational and technical education at Madison Park, to make sure that we're making the investments that we need, the capital investments, and renovating and rebuilding our schools, our facilities across the board. We see the challenges that our physical plants, our physical structures have during this time, and all that's missing. We need to get our kids back in school, and we need to make sure that we can do it in a safe way. And COVID has shown that bright light on some of the inequities and the inadequate structures and infrastructure that our schools are. All of that is really important to me and a big part of my work on the council.
What you have to deal with right now in the school system, you have a lot of students who've lost ground directly or indirectly because of the pandemic. You're going to have a real serious budget challenge. So what do you hope to accomplish there?
Yeah, our kids are missing so much. We only have a very small percentage of our most highest needs students with the opportunity to be in person right now. And some of those kids are in classrooms. Some of them are doing the sort of the hybrid model and learning from home. We need to work and with a certain urgency to get all of our kids back into our classrooms, and obviously back into our classrooms safely. We need our teachers vaccinated, and we need our kids to have access to their academics in person, because too many of our kids have fallen behind. We know the academic and the achievement gap is wide. This pandemic, and for our students in the Boston Public Schools, that gap has widened to I don't know what the appropriate analogy is. It's too much. We've seen an increase in our failure rate across the district. And we've also seen, if not, outside of the academic failures of our kids, we have seen a tremendous increase in mental health issues and the crisis that too many of our kids are now having because of isolation, because of social distancing, because of physical distancing from one another, and the lack of access to a lot of the services they were getting while in school. It's a tremendous problem. It's a huge crisis. And as we work to get our kids back in school, we need to make sure that those services are there when they arrive back in our classrooms.
Part of what's going to be taking shape in this year's election is going to be a question of differences between candidates and differences between city councilors. I'm looking back to last year, the middle of the year, the debate over the budget, how far to go with police reform and shifting the funds. And you didn't want to go as far as some of the other councilors. Why was that?
Yeah, no, there was a certain call by a number of colleagues to defund the police 100%, and that's not acceptable here in the city of Boston. We've got a great policing force here. Boston Police Department is, Boston's finest, is the country's first. And sure, we need reform, and I've supported a great deal of that reform on the council through the work both of colleagues and the mayor. That work is important and necessary. But we also need to make sure that our communities are safe, that our residents, when they call 911, that there's a response that's appropriate. And that's why I've worked with Boston Police and with community advocates around increasing the supports for mental health professionals that both co-respond with police and are much more proactive in supporting our residents who are having a mental health crisis, who are in need of different services outside of a police response. It's really important to me. It's been a big part of my work on the council since I joined in 2016. And I'm so excited with those additional investments, the support services we're able to give our residents, again, across all communities, but in particular, the work of many of our mental health providers, our social workers, who are able to support those that are dealing with substance use disorders in the Mass and Cass area and beyond.
Well, one question the city council has on its plate right now is whether we have a special election for mayor or just have, aside from that, in addition, a single election cycle. Some people wish the city council didn't have to make this decision because some of them might be running. But on the other hand, there's a vote that might be coming up tomorrow. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, my understanding is that vote will be before the body. That petition will be before our body tomorrow at our weekly meeting. I will be voting present. I will be recusing myself from that vote. I think it's wholly inappropriate for me as an at-large counselor and candidate for mayor to be voting on a petition that so directly impacts both me as a candidate for mayor, my strategy around campaigning, and very directly fundraising for that race. It is unethical for sure for me to participate in that vote. And there was some question whether or not we should be participating in even the discussions, the hearings and the working sessions through that petition. So I've stepped aside during that whole debate and conversation. And I do trust my colleagues that should be participating in that to make a vote that is best for the people of Boston. Having safe, fair, and accessible elections is so critically important during all times, but especially during this time. We have so much voter disenfranchisement. It is important that those elections are safe. And at the same time, it's also important that I'm making decisions thoughtfully, and the decision to remove myself from this debate and from this vote is one that I feel was the most appropriate. I think it's inappropriate to participate where it's so directly impacted me.
I'm going to ask you about one other kind of charter change that might be less conflicting. There's been more talk lately about having an elected school committee or having a partially elected school committee.
Did you just say less controversial topic?
Nothing's less controversial, maybe, but should that be at least explored in some way?
Yeah, I've actually called for a hearing to explore the governance structure of the Boston School Committee. Again, as a student myself, when I was in high school, I was very much engaged in the Boston Student Advisory Council. In fact, unfortunately lost to be the student member to the Boston School Committee. We've called for a hearing on the governance structure. I think it's really important that we make sure that our Boston School Committee is responsive and responsible to the people of Boston, especially our students and families of the Boston Public Schools. And another piece that I have filed last year and then refiled at the beginning of this year is to ensure that the student member of the school committee have the ability to be a full voting member and receive the same stipend as all the other committee members. It's really important. The student currently, Kamani James, is very much engaged in the work of the school committee, but I've been so impressed over many, many years of the student representative and their both interest, active engagement, and I'd say very mature participation in all conversations around the school committee. Tomorrow, we're kicking off the BPS budget process. It's an important part of our budgeting cycle. It is the first one that we publicly participate in. That presentation will happen later this week. And the student member actively engages in that discussion around the funding for the Boston Public Schools. They should have the right to vote, and they should also have access to that stipend.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Chris. It's always great to see you.
Good to see you again. Boston City Councilor and candidate for mayor of Boston, Annissa Essaibi George. We'll have more news in just a moment.